Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, and I am currently in Colombia, South America, so I don't have my usual lab, my usual props. But that's okay, because most of what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about in PowerPoint with slides from the Book of Grinding. And what we are going to talk about today is wheel and workpiece regenerative chatter. So chatter, there are all different types of chatter. There is what I call fish scale chatter. There is what I call snakeskin chatter. There's chatter caused by an untrue wheel, an out of balance wheel. And then there's regenerative self-excited chatter, which is what typically most people think of as chatter. And that's basically, in my terms, the wheel just starts bouncing around at its natural frequency. Okay, and this chatter can be maddening. My approach to most of my courses, if you've taken my 3-day high-intensity grinding course, or if you've taken any of my online Zoom classes, you'll know that my philosophy that I preach is I try to not just tell people about grinding or what to do in grinding, but I try to have them understand the fundamental mechanisms of what's happening and have them kind of take ownership of the concepts and the knowledge, so that when things come up, instead of just saying, hey, this happened, the grinding doc told me to do this, they say, oh, this happened, it's caused by this, and the solution in these situations is X, and the solution in these situations is Y, unless this comes into play. And that's a much better approach, because then people understand why the solution works, when it doesn't work. Chatter can get so darn complicated that I would need about 3 days to explain it all. And I don't even consider myself a chatter expert, or I don't consider myself a vibrations expert, because really chatter is just vibration. It's really less to do with grinding and more to do with vibration. And I don't even consider myself an expert on vibration and chatter. But it would take, it's a complicated subject, and I could talk for days on chatter. But what I am going to do in this short video is explain the fundamental mechanisms of what causes what is called wheel and workpiece regeneration in chatter. So what actually causes that wheel to start bouncing up and down? And it's not forced chatter. Forced chatter is something banging that shouldn't be banging, or something out of balance that shouldn't be out of balance. Regenerative chatter is things just start bouncing around seemingly for no reason. Now there is a reason, but sometimes it seems like it's seemingly for no reason. And for regenerative chatter, it has to do with a force, excitation force, causing the system to excite itself, which causes varying depths of cut, with lobes on the workpiece or on the wheel, which causes varying depths of cut, which causes varying forces, which is an excitation force, which makes this thing even worse. So I'm going to spend a few minutes trying to explain the reasons why. You're not going to get any good solutions out of this, or not any good, okay, just do this to get rid of chatter. If you're interested in that, which I assume a lot of people are, take my 3-day high-intensity grinding course, or take my 2-hour Zoom lunch course. That is very focused on, we're not going to explain to you the reasons why, because it takes too long. We're going to explain to you what to do so you can deal with this chatter, get rid of the chatter, reduce the chatter, avoid the chatter. But in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to explain to you the mechanisms of what causes this self-excitation, this self-regeneration to occur. So let's get into that now. Okay, we're going to talk about regenerative chatter. Sometimes it's called self-excited chatter, sometimes it's called workpiece regenerative chatter or wheel regenerative chatter. These are two different phenomena, in fact. These are two different phenomena, but the mechanism surrounding how they are generated is somewhat similar. So we're going to go through these one by one. The slides that you're about to see here come from the Book of Grinding. If you've taken my 3-day high-intensity grinding course, or you've taken one of my Zoom courses, you're familiar with the Book of Grinding. And these come from the section on either the section on chatter or the section on cylindrical plunge grinding. Here is a photograph of a chattered workpiece. This was a company I worked at in Sweden probably 20 plus years ago. They were grinding some kind of threads and steel, and they had chatter. And you can see these chatter marks here. Typically chatter takes the form of scallops, sometimes lobes and sometimes scallops, but the main thing is you see these chatter marks. And we're going to talk about how these chatter marks develop. And there are different types of chatter. There are a whole bunch of different types. So we're going to talk about probably the most common type, and that is the self-excited regenerative type. But there's all different types of chatter. Snakeskin chatter, fish scale chatter, one-end chatter due to out of balance or out of true wheel, and all different types. But we're going to talk about the most common, which is regenerative. So let's start with some basic math. Now, this is a formula that I pulled from an actual academic paper on chatter, and a lot of my work comes from taking the academic work and translating it into plain English. So there's a lot of really, really good work done and put down in academic articles. And in terms of vibration or chatter, the math required to understand these articles can get very, very complex. And I have trouble. I've got a PhD in engineering and all that, and I have trouble getting through some of this math. And it takes me time to translate that to plain English, but we have to write these articles in terms of this complex mathematics, because that's really the only way we can understand it. So what you're getting in the Book of Grinding or in videos like these often is a translation of some of these complicated technical jargon and whatnot into plain English. Doesn't mean the work is bad. I mean, it's very, very good work, but it can be hard to decipher. So this is work done by Inosaki. He is one of the world grinding gurus. He's in Japan, and he wrote an article back in 1980, but that's a long time ago, but it doesn't mean it doesn't apply. The concepts that we learned back in 1970s and 80s still apply today, because grinding is grinding. And he wrote a paper, Stability Limit of Regenerative Chatter in Cylindrical Plunge Grinding, a proposal of the practical stability limit equation. Okay, so a lot of what you're going to see here is pulled from articles like these. Now, chatter is a very unpleasant subject. Of all the subjects in grinding, thermal damage, temperatures, wheel wear, burr, burn, all different types, different geometries, different material types. Chatter is probably my least favorite subject because there's just so many different types of chatter and it can get complicated. Even the godfather of production engineering, Frederick Winslow Taylor, wasn't a fan of chatter in machining, and he said chatter is the most obscure and delicate of all problems facing the machinist. And that was certainly true then, back in 1906, and even though we've got a better understanding of chatter now, I would say it's still true today. So let's start with workpiece regenerative chatter. We have two types. We have workpiece regenerative and we have wheel regenerative, and we're going to take each of them one by one. Workpiece regenerative is probably more common. Workpiece regenerative begins earlier. You can start to see workpiece regenerative chatter develop just in the first few seconds of grinding sometimes, or the first few revolutions of the workpiece in cylindrical grinding. Wheel regenerative chatter takes longer. That can take minutes or even hours to develop. Okay, but let's start with a workpiece regenerative. So let's take a wheel and a workpiece, and I've drawn that wheel as a spring, or really it's the wheel spindle assembly can be thought of as a spring because that guy pushes back. There's a certain stiffness in that. Stiffness, the inverse of stiffness is compliance, and I call compliance springiness. It's not the technical term, it's my term, and I like my term. And that wheel likes to bounce up and down due to the springiness in the system. In this particular case, let's just throw out a number and say 120 times a second, 120 hertz or 120 bounces per second. So that guy wants to bounce up and down. Now I'm going to take away the spring. That guy wants to bounce up and down 120 times a second. And that might be a little bit low, but I've chosen some values just to make it easier to illustrate. A typical cylindrical grinder might bounce up and down at, say, 500 bounces per second or 500 hertz. So that wheel is going boing, 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 up and down at its natural frequency of 500 bounces a second. In this particular case, I've chosen 120 bounces a second. So that's its natural frequency. Now we go to grind, and I've chosen some other values here that are a little bit odd, at least in terms of the Workpiece RPM, but I've chosen them just to make it easier to visualize. And we've got that Workpiece going at 720 RPM, which is 12 revolutions a second. And we've got the wheel going at 1800 RPM, or 30 revolutions per second. That would be more typical of a cylindrical grinder. And here's where we're at. Now, it would be nice if during grinding, the force that develops between the wheel and the Workpiece was steady. So when we go to grind, and once we reach steady state and we've got full contact, the Workpiece is pushing up on the wheel with a certain force, and then according to Newton's law of motion, that wheel is pushing back down on the Workpiece with an equal and opposite force. That force is in pounds or kilograms or newtons, whatever you want to use. And there's a force. We're going to focus now just on the force pushing up on the wheel. Now, it would be nice if that force was steady. It was a steady 10 pounds or 5 kilos or whatever it was. And that would be nice. However, that's not what happens. That force varies a little bit. Now, why does it vary? It varies for a number of reasons. The wheel is not perfectly balanced. The wheel is not perfectly true. The wheel is not perfectly eccentric. Some parts of the wheel are sharper than other parts of the wheel. So what we get is a varying force pushing up on the wheel. Now, when that varying force pushes up on the wheel, that is what we call an excitation source. That is going to cause that wheel to bounce up and down 120 times a second. So even if that force is kind of random, that force is going to cause that wheel to oscillate even a little bit up and down 120 times a second, or 120 bounces per second. But so far, it's not a problem. And it's not a problem until it starts to become a problem. Now what happens is that guy's bouncing up and down 120 bounces a second, even if it's a little bit. And when he does that, he puts a certain number of lobes into the Workpiece. And we know the number of lobes. If we take the natural frequency, here we've got 120. And we take the Workpiece speed, here we've got 12 revolutions per second. 120 divided by 12. In this particular case, we have exactly 10. It's usually not exact, and that does come into play. So we have 120 bounces per second over 12 revolutions per second. The seconds cancel, and we get 10 bounces per revolution. So every time that Workpiece, makes one revolution, that wheel is bounced up and down 10 times. And when he bounces up and down 10 times, he's going to create 10 lobes on the Workpiece. Now we've got 10 lobes on the Workpiece. And as we have 10 lobes on the Workpiece, that depth of cut is going to vary. Sometimes it's going to get a little deeper, sometimes it's going to be a little less deep. And if that depth of cut varies 10 times per revolution, then the force pushing up on the wheel is also going to vary even a little bit. So now we've got those 10 lobes causing the depth of cut to get bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller. It's getting bigger and smaller 10 times per revolution. And that bigger and smaller force is an excitation force. It is exciting the system 10 times per revolution of the Workpiece. However, we've got 10 lobes on the wheel, 10 lobes per rev, and we have 12 revs per second. 10 times 12 is 120 lobes per second, is 124 force pulsations per second. Well, lo and behold, 120 force pulsations per second just happens to be the natural frequency of that spindle, that wheel. So what we're doing is we're exciting the system, which is what we were doing anyway, but now we're exciting the system even more because of the lobes on the wheel, workpiece, and we're exciting that system at exactly this natural frequency of the wheel. And that's why we call it regeneration, because we place lobes in there, in the workpiece, and then those lobes come back to haunt us by exciting the system at exactly the natural frequency of the system. So now what happens is we start to get even bigger lobes, because remember, we're exciting that guy at the natural frequency, so that wheel is now bouncing up and down even more. So that force pulsation gets even bigger, the excitation source, which causes the wheel to bounce up and down even higher, which causes the lobes to get even bigger, which causes the depth of cut to vary even more, which causes the force pulsations to get even bigger, which causes the wheel to bounce up and down even more. And next thing you know, things are crazy and we are just out of control. We've got out of control chatter happening, 120 bounces a second, 10 lobes on the workpiece, and things are just crazy, mad, out of control. Now that is a very, very basic explanation. It gets a lot more complicated. It depends a lot on the stiffness of that wheel. It depends on whether there's any phase shift between that natural frequency divided by the workpiece RPM. It depends on things called the cutting stiffness and the contact stiffness and the dynamic stiffness. So this is just a very basic explanation of why we call it regenerative chatter, because it has a way of regenerating itself. So it's kind of like Bud and Joe in the factory. Bud says it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I poke at Joe slightly, which causes Joe to lash out slightly, which causes me to poke at Joe even more and harder, which causes Joe to lash out even harder, which causes me to, which causes Joe to. It's sort of like regenerative chatter in grinding. It starts off small, but it just sort of causes itself to get out of control, and that's why we call it regeneration. Now, a large part of my life is camped out on the shop floor of grinding facilities, measuring, studying, changing, comparing wheels. A large part of it is processing those results late at night all by myself. A lot of my work is taking academic articles and reading them and translating them into plain English. And that's a lot of time on the computer by myself, late at night, weekends, whenever. And so sometimes I get a little bored and I do stuff. I create slides. All right, so that's what we have. We've got Bud the Button Pusher, Joe the Grinder, and Lefty. If you buy the Book of Grinding, you get a copy with attending one of the courses. You will see a lot of Bud, Joe, and Lefty. But the basic point is that this thing just starts regenerating itself. The wheel likes to bounce up and down. It creates lobes in the workpiece. Those lobes in the workpiece go back and poke the bear and cause the wheel to bounce up and down even more. That bouncing up and down even more creates even bigger lobes. Those bigger lobes create even more bouncing. The more bouncing create even bigger lobes. The bigger lobes create even more bouncing, and things are out of control. Now, there are things you can do about this, and we're not going to get into it here because it gets complicated, and I could spend 3 days talking about chatter. There are things you can do like varying the workpiece RPM so that you're not exciting at the natural frequency. You can have a longer arc of cut so that these waves sort of attenuate or obliterate themselves. You can mess around with something called the cutting stiffness. You can work on the system stiffness. You can do a frequency response function to figure out what that stiffness, how that stiffness varies at different frequencies. It gets complicated, but it can be useful. But my goal is just to get you guys to understand the fundamental mechanisms behind workpiece regenerative chatter so that when you start getting into some of the explanations or some of the things you can do to get rid of it, alleviate it, you have an understanding of what actually is causing this thing. Okay, so now we're going to get into wheel regenerative chatter. And again, some people, I use my own terminology. I take a lot of the academic jargon and I convert it to my own terminology. Bounces per second instead of hertz, springiness instead of dynamic compliance, things getting ugly instead of the threshold for dynamic instability, things just bouncing around instead of stochastic, nodal dependent, phase incident, regenerative, induced gamma displacement. Okay, I made that one up myself. Okay, now let's get into wheel regenerative chatter, which is different than workpiece regenerative chatter. And they're kind of the same, the mechanisms are sort of the same, but they are different animals. Workpiece regenerative chatter begins pretty quickly often. It can happen in the first few seconds of grinding for only a few revolutions of the workpiece. Wheel regenerative chatter requires the wheel to wear away. Now, if you're grinding PCD with a diamond wheel, that wheel will wear away pretty darn quickly. But most people are grinding steels, often with aluminum oxide, and we have to wait for the wheel to wear. That depends on the G ratio, depends on a lot of things, and that takes time. So therefore, wheel regenerative chatter can take minutes, even hours to develop. So let's go back to our springy wheel and our workpiece. Now that wheel still likes to bounce up and down 120 times a second, 120 bounces a second, and he's going to grind, and that wheel is gradually going to wear away. All that bouncing up and down means that the wheel is not going to wear evenly. It's not going to wear from a big circle to a small circle. It's going to wear from a big circle to some kind of funky shape, because that guy is bouncing up and down, and he's going to develop lobes on the wheel. And the number of lobes on the wheel will be something like the natural frequency, 120 bounces per second, divided by the wheel speed. We're running now at 30 revs per second. 120 divided by 30 is 4. So we're going to get 4 lobes on that wheel. Okay, now we've got 4 lobes on the wheel because that guy is bouncing up and down. Even if he's only bouncing up and down a little bit, just due to some kind of random noise in the force, that's going to cause that guy to wear away and develop these lobes on the wheel. Now that force then is going to vary. Now we've got these 4 lobes on the wheel, and those 4 lobes are going to bang against the wheel. So now we have an unwound wheel that's banging 4 times per revolution. And if we're banging 4 times per revolution, and we're running at 30 revolutions a second, 4 times 30 is 120. And what is our natural frequency? 120 bounces per second. So now we have an excitation source, and this excitation source is different. This excitation source is caused by the lobes on the wheel. So that wheel is no longer round, it's got these lobes on it, and those lobes are going to bang on the workpiece, and that banging is going to cause a force pulsation. That force pulsation is going to cause the wheel to bounce up and down. The wheel bouncing up and down is going to cause even more uneven wear, which is going to cause even bigger force pulsations, and next thing you know, we've got the crazy regeneration. Things are out of control once again. Now it's a different animal than the workpiece regenerative chatter because the source is no longer lobes on the workpiece, this excitation source, the source is lobes on the wheel. But it's kind of a similar type of phenomenon. So now here we are banging 120 bangs a second, or 4 per revolution of the wheel. And now we get even more wear, and so those force pulsations get even bigger. And now things are even more out of control. So our excitation source is an unwound wheel or uneven wheel wear. So it's going to take time. So if we have an aluminum oxide wheel grinding high-speed steel, it might happen within a few minutes. If we have a CBN wheel grinding soft steel, it might take hours before that wheel regenerative chatter generates. Now, we don't really get into it here, but one quick solution if you have wheel regenerative chatter is just dress your wheel, dress away those lobes. That will help you with wheel regenerative chatter. It won't necessarily help you with workpiece regenerative chatter. Okay, but again, my goal here is not to get into all the solutions. There are some solutions, and we talk about those in other episodes. My goal is to explain how the phenomenon is occurring. And then when we start getting into other things like obliteration, attenuation, longer arc lengths, things like that, then hopefully they will make more sense. Okay, but fundamentally this is what we're dealing with. Or if we want to speed it up, we saw something like that, and things just start getting crazy, and then of course I don't show it here, but with that wheel bouncing up and down, we're going to get chatter marks on the workpiece. So I hope that was helpful. That is a very, very simple introduction. It's a lot more complicated. We've got to deal with phase shifts. We've got to deal with all these other type of things, resonant frequencies. But that is just a fundamental introduction of why we call it wheel and workpiece regenerative chatter and why it is this regeneration effect. If you want to learn more about actually how to deal with chatter, how to get rid of it, reduce it, you have a couple options. You can take my 3-day high-intensity grinding course, which hopefully will be resuming soon now that hopefully COVID is kind of winding down with the vaccines, or not as bad. Or I have a grinding lunch, which is a short 2-hour lunch, which is how to deal with chatter. We don't necessarily get into explaining the fundamental mechanisms because that takes time, like we did here, but we get into, okay, what are the practical solutions I can do to deal with chatter to keep Bud, Lefty, Joe, and Helmut from going crazy.